The storm hit 2 nights after they demolished it. I warned them, begged them, even handed them hydrological data printed in full color with my signature at the bottom. Still, they stood there smirking in their shiny HOA polos, bulldozers grinding into the earth like it was their personal sandbox. That dam wasn't ornamental, it was functional. 12 feet of compacted soil engineered to hold back 300 gallons of seasonal runoff from the hills above. But they thought it was an eyesore. Now, standing on my high porch, dry as a bone, I watched their brand new cookie-cutter neighborhood turn into a muddy, sewage-tainted lake. The HOA had turned a warning into a catastrophe. Tell me, what do you do when people destroy what protects them and blame you for not stopping them harder? The first time I met Karen Sutterfield, she was standing on the gravel edge of my land in designer boots that had never seen a day of mud in their life. She had a clipboard in one hand and a thermos labeled HOA Executive Fuel in the other. Behind her stood 2 board members from the newly formed Vista Ridge Heights Homeowners Association, a housing development that hadn't even finished its final row of cookie-cutter homes yet. The homes were modern, sleek, and planted like plastic Monopoly pieces on what used to be open pasture land just below the ridge I owned. My land, by contrast, was old, weathered, and elevated, the kind of place that had survived 3 generations of stubborn farmers before me. And smack in the middle of that land was the dam. 16 years ago, a flash flood turned my lowest field into a swamp overnight and drowned my first barn under 4 feet of dirty runoff. That's when I built the dam, 12 feet of packed clay, reinforced with geogrid and native stone, designed to hold back seasonal water that thundered down from the northern hills. It wasn't pretty, but it was damn functional. For 16 years, it had done its job without fail. Until Karen decided it was a visual blight. I remember her exact words. "It doesn't fit the community aesthetic," she said, gesturing to it like it was a trash pile and not critical infrastructure. "We're establishing a natural look for the Vista Ridge Basin, and that includes rewilding the creek beds and removing unnatural obstructions." I blinked at her, then looked out at the dam, then back at her. "Ma'am," I said as politely as I could muster, "that obstruction is the reason your subdivision isn't already a pond." She gave a smile so tight it looked stapled to her face. "Well, our surveyors reviewed the area, and we didn't see any official structures noted on the parcel overlays." My jaw clenched. It's not some cowboy construction. It was permitted, inspected, and reapproved every 5 years by the State Water Authority. I've got binders full of documentation in my office if you'd care to review them. She didn't care. That much was clear from the way she turned back toward her board members and made a note on her clipboard like I'd just confessed to a felony. "It's on our agenda to address. Thank you for your input." A week later, I got the first citation in my mailbox. Unauthorized earthworks obstructing visual flow and shared watershed appearance. It was printed on HOA letterhead, but I wasn't a member of their HOA. My land predated their development by 70 years. I wasn't in their jurisdiction. They didn't care. I called their office. The receptionist transferred me to the compliance officer, who sounded like he was reading from a script when he told me, "All neighboring structures impacting the watershed area fall under Vista Ridge review per the new buffer zone clause." Buffer zone clause? That wasn't in any county code I knew. I checked with the registrar's office. They hadn't filed it. It was HOA, internal policy, self-imposed, self-regulated, and somehow they thought it gave them the right to tell me what I could do on my own land. I wrote a formal rebuttal and mailed it, with attachments, the original dam permit, the 2019 inspection report, even a photograph of the flood damage from 2007, complete with timestamp. The citation stood. Then came the second notice, then a fine, then a threat of legal escalation if non-compliance persisted. It would have been laughable if it weren't so dangerously stupid. The dam didn't just protect me. It protected them. The new homes down in Vista Ridge were built directly on what used to be a seasonal floodplain. Any heavy rainfall that came down from the northern hill system channeled directly through that valley. That's why the dam existed in the first place. Not for aesthetics, not for recreation, but to slow the flow and disperse the water evenly over drainage fields and retention soil. Without it, All that runoff would tear through the basin and drown the lowest streets like they were bathtub toys. I scheduled a meeting with the HOA board. I figured if they saw the data, they'd come to their senses. I walked into the clubhouse conference room with printed charts, laminated maps, and a USB drive full of survey scans. Karen sat at the head of the table flanked by board members who looked like they'd never touched a shovel in their lives. I explained everything: the flood patterns, the dam's capacity, the emergency overflow channel I built in 2011. I handed out copies of the hydrological assessment signed by a state-licensed civil engineer. One of them asked if my dam was Climate Smart certified. Another asked if it could be converted into a community water feature. Karen didn't ask anything. She stared at me the whole time like I was an unwanted weed in her rose garden. When I finished, she slid her copy of the assessment back toward me without even looking at it. "We appreciate your passion," she said. "But Vista Ridge has a comprehensive land harmony initiative, and we can't make exceptions for outdated private structures that visually disrupt the planned environmental aesthetic." I stared at her for a long time. "Are you seriously telling me you want to tear down the one thing keeping your development from flooding?" She smiled. "With proper landscaping and native vegetation, we believe we can manage surface runoff more organically." I nearly laughed. "Organically? You think a couple of willow trees are going to hold back 30,000 gallons of runoff from a storm cell?" Karen tilted her head like I was speaking another language. "We've consulted with our design team. You'll be expected to comply." And that was it. Meeting adjourned. No further discussion. Just a wave of her hand and a fake thank you from the board secretary. From that point on, it became war by paperwork. Weekly letters, escalating fines, final warnings, and threats to escalate the matter to county mediation, even though they didn't have jurisdiction. I filed a cease and desist letter through my attorney, reminding them, again, that the dam was state permitted, on private land, and protected by conservation infrastructure law. They ignored it. My mailbox became a landfill of pastel-colored envelopes from the Vista Ridge HOA Compliance Department. It became clear they didn't care about the facts. They were treating the dam like a rogue birdbath, not critical infrastructure. They tried to classify it as unauthorized landscaping. One letter claimed it violated their neighborhood's view cohesion principles. Another claimed it interfered with property values. What property values? My land wasn't for sale. They didn't care. They wanted the dam gone, not because it was dangerous, but because it didn't match their Pinterest board. One afternoon, I saw a small group of HOA board members parked just outside the easement, pointing at the dam and talking amongst themselves. I walked down the trail to confront them. Karen didn't even wait for me to speak. "You'll be receiving a formal removal request by the end of the week," she said, her tone clipped and official. "This structure violates the visual integrity of our basin plan, and our environmental committee has unanimously voted for its deconstruction." I held up my phone. "You're trespassing, and if you send someone onto my land without legal authority, I'll treat it as a criminal act." She didn't flinch. "We're not stepping foot on your land. Yet." Her board members chuckled. I walked away. I should have called the sheriff right then. Maybe it would have scared them off. But I figured no one was stupid enough to touch a federally permitted dam without approval. I underestimated the power of arrogance and HOA delusion. The last letter I received before things really went to hell was titled Final Enforcement Action. It was written like a declaration of war. The dam would be removed to restore natural harmony to the Vista Ridge watershed. And if I did not do so myself, the HOA would contract licensed environmental restoration specialists to perform the necessary work. It was dated, signed, and stamped like they were God's own surveyors. I took it straight to my attorney. He laughed at first, then stopped laughing when he saw the contractor's name, Melford Solutions, a real firm, real equipment, real money behind it. "They're not bluffing," he said. "They're going to do it, illegally, but they're going to try." I called the water board, filed an emergency alert, sent every agency I could think of an email. But before anything could happen, before the state could reply, before the sheriff could be briefed, the machines were already moving, and the storm was already forming. It started with a tremor in the walls and the unmistakable groan of diesel engines. I was sipping black coffee on my porch, watching the morning mist rise off the ridge, when the sound hit me like a punch to the gut. Bulldozers. More than one. I knew the sound too well. My father ran heavy machinery his whole life. What I didn't expect was to hear it on my land. I stood up, the mug still in my hand, and scanned the tree line toward the northern edge of the dam. There they were. 2 Cat D5 bulldozers, yellow as sin and already halfway through my property line, their tracks grinding into my soil like they had every right in the world. Between them stood a cluster of men in neon vests marked Melford Solutions, the same company the HOA letter had mentioned. A white F-150 idled nearby, hazard lights blinking, and out stepped Karen Sutterfield in sunglasses and a windbreaker that said Vista Ridge Environmental Committee. She looked pleased, like a queen surveying a conquered kingdom. I didn't even put on shoes. I stormed down the trail barefoot, heart pounding hard enough to drown out the engine noise. "Stop!" I shouted, waving my arms. "Get those machines off my land!" One of the crew glanced at me but kept operating the controls. The dozer's blade sank into the outer berm of the dam, slicing through packed clay like it was nothing. Karen turned, lifted her sunglasses, and said it with a straight face. "You were given sufficient notice. We're executing the removal as authorized by the HOA Environmental Restoration Initiative." My voice cracked with fury. "This is private land. You don't have the right. You don't even have a permit." She shrugged. "We believe the dam violates basin harmony and presents a potential hazard. If it was that critical, it would have been documented in our zoning plan." That was the moment I realized the depth of their delusion. In their minds, their HOA binder overrode state law. A clipboard full of aesthetic violations trumped a decade-old engineering permit signed by a state hydrologist. I ran back up to the house and dialed the county sheriff. "Trespass in progress," I said. "Heavy equipment, property damage. I need deputies now." The dispatcher promised they'd send someone immediately. By the time I got back down to the dam, the damage was irreversible. They had breached the southern lip of the dam, the retaining wall that held the structure's entire hydraulic integrity. It was like popping a balloon. Water had already begun trickling out in ribbons, like veins opening under the skin of the earth. The crew kept going, methodical, clinical, like they were removing an old shed instead of sabotaging a flood retention system. I got in front of the lead dozer and planted myself in the clay, screaming for them to stop, waving the original permit in my hand. The driver finally cut the engine. "We're just following work orders," he said through the cracked window. "Signed and stamped by the HOA board. We were told this is community infrastructure." "This is my land," I barked. "They don't own an inch of it. You're trespassing. You're committing a felony." He hesitated, then got on his radio. That was when Karen called the bluff I didn't realize she had prepared. A man in a blue windbreaker stepped out of the truck behind her. "We have visual evidence of runoff intrusion into the Vista Ridge watershed," he said calmly. "This structure may have altered natural water flow in violation of local guidelines." He didn't identify himself. He didn't show a badge, just said it like gospel. My fingers tightened around the permit. "Do you even know what the Clean Water Act is?" I snapped. "Do you know what a state-registered dam even means?" They didn't. Or they didn't care. Maybe both. What they did care about was making sure the dozers kept moving. 23 minutes after I called, a sheriff's cruiser pulled up at the gate. Deputy Lasky, a man I'd known for years, got out and hustled down the trail. His face said everything. "I came as fast as I could," he said, eyeing the torn berm and the equipment. "But I can't stop this without a standing injunction or a signed cease order." "It's on file," I told him. "My attorney submitted it this morning." He shook his head. "That might not be enough. If they're claiming this is HOA jurisdiction, we're looking at a civil boundary issue unless a crime's committed outright." I gestured to the ripped clay, the gaping hole where my dam used to hold firm. "What do you call this, landscaping?" Lasky sighed. "You and I both know this is garbage, but unless someone gets hurt or you can prove federal infrastructure was destroyed, I don't have the power to cuff anybody. Not yet." I wanted to scream, to swing. But there were 5 workers, 2 machines, and Karen watching like a smug war general from the ridge. "We'll file it," I muttered. "Every damn angle." That afternoon, I called my attorney. We drafted a formal complaint. We filed for immediate injunctive relief. We submitted a damage report. I emailed every document I had to the State Water Board, to FEMA, to the local Department of Environmental Protection. But bureaucracy moves at the speed of sludge. Meanwhile, the destruction moved at the speed of diesel. By 6 p.m., the dam was reduced to a gouged trench, the once compacted wall now a smear of mud pushed down into the lowlands. The runoff basin behind it had begun to drain slowly, releasing weeks of rainwater in a slow but steady trickle downhill. The machines packed up and left. Karen followed them out in her SUV, giving me one last glance through the tinted glass before vanishing down the gravel path like a villain exiting stage left. My boots sank into what used to be the dam's crown. I crouched down, picked up a chunk of torn clay, and crushed it in my fist. Years. Years of planning, construction, maintenance. Gone in one afternoon by people who thought a Pinterest aesthetic was more important than hydrodynamics. That night, I didn't sleep. The wind howled over the ridge and shook the pine trees with unnatural force. I checked the radar. A weather system had formed over the adjacent county and was drifting east fast. Heavy rainfall likely, the forecast said. Localized flooding possible in low-lying areas. My gut twisted. Vista Ridge wasn't just low-lying, it was a bowl. A big, polished porcelain bowl with no plug. And now, the thing that held back the tide, the one piece of infrastructure that stood between them and catastrophe, was a smear of broken earth. I emailed Karen again. Attached the storm alert, the floodplain map, the new runoff projections. I titled the email, "Urgent. You've put lives at risk." I never got a reply. Not even a bounce back. The next morning, the first drops began to fall. I stood on my porch and watched them bead along the railing. Cold, heavy, determined. The runoff always moved fast after the first inch soaked the topsoil, and now there was nothing to slow it down. The clock had started. They had pulled the trigger. And the valley below was about to learn what nature thought of Vista Ridge's visual cohesion. The rain came like a wall, not a curtain. Not a gentle spring drizzle, or the kind of lazy summer soak that gave life to wildflowers. This was different. It slammed into the ridge like a goddamn freight train. Sheets of water turned the sky into a slate-gray blur, and the first rumble of thunder wasn't distant. It was overhead, loud enough to rattle the cast-iron pan off the stove and wake up every bird in the valley. I stood on my porch, wrapped in an old oilskin coat, watching as the first few minutes turned my gravel driveway into a bubbling stream. But I wasn't worried. My home was built on rock, 30 feet above the basin, and anchored in soil that had survived a 100-year flood before. I had lived through storms worse than this. The difference was, back then, the dam stood in place. It was the equalizer, the slow hand of control that gave the earth time to breathe. But now, it was gone. Scraped apart by people who thought their lawn symmetry mattered more than hydrodynamics. I looked down the slope, past the tree line, toward Vista Ridge. The rooftops were barely visible through the rain, but I could already see it. The shimmer of pooled water where streets should have been. The glint of taillights bouncing like reflections in a puddle. The first part of their new development, the phase closest to the runoff's path, was starting to drown. By the 1-hour mark, the rain gauge on my porch hit 1.2 inches. That's when the lower retention fields would have normally kicked in, the shallow basins I had terraced years ago to collect excess water before it reached the dam. But with the dam destroyed, the flow had nowhere to slow, no place to redirect. Everything the hillside shed now raced straight down the ridge at full velocity. I could see it, even through the haze, a silver-brown torrent snaking through the pines, carving a new path where none existed before. The storm drains in Vista Ridge weren't designed for this. How could they be? Their planners had removed the largest hydraulic buffer in the area. They didn't plan around the dam, they erased it. I poured myself a second cup of coffee, sat down in my rocking chair, and watched as nature began to enforce what bureaucracy had ignored. In under 2 hours, the first emergency vehicle appeared. A fire engine from County Station 12, wading through 2 feet of water on Glendale Court. I could see its flashing lights submerged to the bottom of the wheel well. They hadn't even made it to the real damage yet. By hour 3, the calls started. First, a voicemail from an unknown number, probably one of the HOA's PR reps or contractors. Then another, then a dozen more. I ignored them. But the one that made my blood boil was Karen's. Her name flashed on my screen like a warning label, and against better judgment, I answered. "What the hell is happening?" She shrieked, not even saying hello. "There's water coming up through our basement vents. Kids are trapped in their homes. Where is this even coming from?" Her voice was panicked, breathless, and soaked with fear. I waited for her to pause before I replied. "The hillside," I said flatly. "Same hillside I told you about, the one the dam held back. Remember that?" "You don't understand," she snapped, her voice cracking. "This is catastrophic. You have to do something. You've lived here longer, can't you divert it? Use the tractor or something?" That's when I laughed, not out of joy, not even malice. It was the kind of laugh that comes when reality is so absurd you can't decide whether to scream or collapse. "You destroyed the one thing that could divert it," I said, the words slow and sharp. "You brought in machines, Karen. You signed off on contractors. You did this, and now you're standing in the consequences." She started to reply, but I hung up. I'd said everything I needed. The 4th hour hit like a second wave. 3 inches in total now, and it wasn't slowing. The local news had issued a flash flood alert. Not a watch, an alert. Aerial footage, captured by a news drone, showed it all. Streets underwater, driveways covered in brown silt, landscaping ripped out by force. One clip showed a swing set floating down a cul-de-sac like a child's toy in bathwater. Another showed a minivan stalled in what used to be a front yard, the current lapping against its doors. Meanwhile, my hilltop stayed dry. The runoff passed cleanly along the old drainage swales I'd maintained for years, curved through my eastern field, and bypassed my property entirely. Because I understood this land, I respected it, and I knew that when you try to pretend nature is ornamental, she will remind you just how violent she can be. Down in Vista Ridge, it was chaos. The HOA's so-called natural water feature, a decorative gravel creek bed they installed after demolishing the dam, had overflowed in the first hour and now cut directly through 3 backyards, dragging mulch, fencing, and a few unlucky patio sets with it. Their native plant buffers were nothing more than ornamental grasses with shallow roots, and they'd been uprooted wholesale. Sod peeled back like soggy cardboard, leaving behind cratered holes of muck and rebar. Basement sump pumps failed. Garage doors bowed from pressure. One woman had to be rescued from her Prius by standing on the hood and screaming until neighbors threw her a rope. And the worst part? The water wasn't clean. It was runoff, mixed with fertilizers, sewage backflow, and every chemical those pristine lawns had been dosed with since the HOA started enforcing their mandatory landscaping rules. I had my camera out by then, not to gloat, to document. My attorney had advised it. "Keep records," he said. "The truth has a funny way of drowning lies if you catch it on video." So I filmed everything, the streams bursting through the tree line, the water ripping through the subdivision, the excavated remains of the dam now serving as a giant drain pipe for nature's fury. I zoomed in on the signs. Vista Ridge, a community in harmony. The irony was cruel. I saw Karen again, this time in a live interview on local TV. Her hair was soaked, her HOA badge still clipped to her vest, and she was trying to explain how a series of unexpected weather events overwhelmed Vista Ridge's new landscaping systems. She didn't mention the dam. Not once. But everyone watching who lived in that valley knew. People talk, contractors gossip, and every homeowner now ankle-deep in mud remembered the old man up on the ridge who tried to warn them. I got another call around dusk, this one from a Vista Ridge resident I'd never met. "Mr. Dalton," the voice said. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry. I didn't know what the HOA did to your dam. They said it was just for looks. They never told us it was functional. My house, it's..." He trailed off. "It's underwater now. I'm just sorry." I thanked him. That was all I could say. Because there were no words for the mess they were now trapped in, a mess of their own making, built on arrogance and maintained by ignorance. It kept raining into the night. Not as hard, but steady, persistent. I stood out on the porch long after the sun went down, listening to the distant hum of generators, the hiss of water, and the occasional cry of sirens. Vista Ridge had become a swamp. A very expensive swamp with granite countertops and underwater mortgages. By morning, rescue crews were still pulling people from flooded basements. The county had issued a hazard zone designation for the entire subdivision. FEMA was being contacted, and the HOA, they went silent. No more threats, no more citations, not even a half-hearted community update on their Facebook page. They were neck-deep in lawsuits already, from homeowners, from the insurance agencies who'd suddenly realized the whole neighborhood sat in a reclassified floodplain, and from my legal team, who had already filed the first round of claims for property damage and unauthorized trespassing. But none of that changed the fact that they had done this to themselves. They ripped out the only safeguard between them and the sky, because they didn't like how it looked in their drone photos, and now they were the ones swimming in the consequences. Literally. My land stayed dry. Not a drop in the barn, not a trickle in the crawl space, just the usual mist hanging in the trees and the smell of pine needles washed clean. I took another walk down to where the dam used to be. The earth was still raw there, still gored open from the machinery. I stood on the edge and looked down at the chaos below. Vista Ridge. Shiny rooftops peeking out of puddles. The HOA that didn't believe in dams now lived in a lake. Mother Nature had redrawn the property lines, and this time, no citation could stop her. I thought they'd go quiet after the flood, after the streets turned into rivers and the basements into cisterns, after the emergency crews waded through sludge to rescue families that had moved in just 6 months prior. After the HOA Facebook page was nuked and replaced by a simple, silent 404. But no. Less than 2 weeks after the skies cleared, I received a packet in the mail, thick as a phone book and stamped by some law office in the Vista Ridge Business District. The HOA was suing me. Gross negligence, reckless endangerment, and, my personal favorite, intentional failure to maintain private flood mitigation infrastructure, resulting in damage to community property. They had the audacity to accuse me of being the reason their homes flooded, as if they hadn't trespassed onto my land. As if they hadn't torn down the very structure designed to keep the water back. As if I hadn't screamed the warnings into their faces, printed the maps, begged them to stop. But the packet didn't make me angry. Not really, because by the time it arrived, the trap was already set. You see, the minute those bulldozers crossed my property line, I filed formal incident reports with every relevant agency I could think of. FEMA, the State Water Board, the Department of Natural Resources, the County Floodplain Commission, and most importantly, the Army Corps of Engineers. Because my dam, modest as it may have seemed, was listed in a 2011 FEMA watershed evaluation as a private flood control structure of strategic interest. It was flagged, documented, and regulated. The permits were on file. The inspection reports had been submitted every 5 years, like clockwork. And when that dam was destroyed, without my consent, without a permit, without an engineering review, that wasn't just a zoning dispute, that was a federal offense. So while Karen Sutterfield and her board of HOA cronies were prepping their lawsuit and holding secret meetings in their flooded clubhouse, I was sitting across from a federal compliance officer in a county annex building, going over my photos, video footage, and signed affidavits. The man's eyebrows rose higher with every page. "They did this without a licensed surveyor present?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "On a Saturday, no paperwork, no permits, just machines and arrogance." He nodded slowly, eyes flicking to the dam's permit number at the top of my packet. "Well then, they just kicked open a very expensive door." 2 weeks after that meeting, the first federal letter went out. It was addressed to the Vista Ridge HOA and the Property Stewardship Committee, which is fancy speak for Karen and her lackeys. The language was legal napalm. Unauthorized alteration of a hydrological safety structure, violation of state conservation statutes, endangerment of downstream populations, and then the real knife. Potential felony violation under Title 33, Chapter 9 of the U.S. Enter. Code relating to unpermitted modifications of federally recorded water infrastructure. I could only imagine the look on Karen's face when that hit her desk. But I didn't have to imagine for long, because 3 days later, she called again. Not to scream, not to accuse, but to beg. "Mr. Dalton," she said, her voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. We didn't understand the dam was registered federally. We were acting on our understanding of local development priorities. I let the silence stretch until it was unbearable. "You trespassed. You ordered demolition. You caused a flood. Understanding doesn't matter anymore. Law does." She started to speak again. I hung up. Then the real storm began. Their lawsuit, dead before it hit court. My lawyer filed a response so stacked with federal and state citations, it might as well have come with a gavel. We included aerial footage, time-stamped emails, affidavits from emergency responders, and, just for good measure, the engineering permit laminated and blown up to 36 inches wide. The judge took one look at the cross-complaint and suggested, very strongly, that the HOA reconsider its position. But it didn't stop there. The Army Corps launched a full investigation. FEMA sent site auditors. State inspectors walked the ruined trench where the dam used to be and took core samples of the earth to confirm unauthorized mechanical disturbance. The result? Criminal charges. Karen Sutterfield was indicted on 3 counts: willful destruction of registered infrastructure, illegal environmental alteration, and reckless endangerment of a protected flood zone. 2 other board members were charged with conspiracy and unlawful trespass. The indictment hit the news like a lightning strike. HOA execs face federal charges after dam disaster. Their neighborhood went from Vista Ridge, a community in harmony, to Vista Ridge, at-risk floodplain, in one government press release. Insurance companies pulled out within the week. Homeowners who had once cheered the dam's removal were now suing the HOA for misrepresentation, negligence, and loss of property value. Mortgage companies froze funding. The county declared a moratorium on new builds in the area pending environmental review. Karen tried to resign, but by then it didn't matter. The HOA treasury was frozen. Their legal defense fund was a joke. Within a month, the Vista Ridge HOA filed for bankruptcy. Their signage, those smug little stone plaques at the subdivision entrances, were quietly removed under cover of night. And the board? Imploded. Karen was last seen leaving the courthouse in sunglasses and a hoodie, ducking local news crews while her lawyer shoved reporters out of the way. It was poetic. And me? I rebuilt the dam. I used the insurance payout from the lawsuit I filed against the HOA because, yes, we countersued and won and upgraded the structure with reinforced concrete, French drains, and a triple-tier spillway that could survive a once-in-a-century storm. It was over-engineered, over-inspected, and over-protected. I invited the state hydrologist to the ribbon cutting. He handed me a new certificate of approval, and, just beneath it, I posted a red steel sign in bold white letters. Protected hydrological infrastructure. Tampering is a federal crime. Violators will be prosecuted. That sign is bolted into a concrete post taller than Karen's ego, and it will outlast all of them. The final blow came when the County Water Board issued a formal apology. They sent a letter on official stationery, embossed and sealed, acknowledging the dam's importance, my cooperation, and the HOA's gross misconduct. "Your commitment to responsible land stewardship is an example to this community," it read. I framed it and hung it inside the barn, the new one, high and dry, with flood-resistant epoxy floors and backup power. My land is quiet again. The water flows where it should. The birds have returned to nest along the spillway. And down in the ruins of Vista Ridge, the silence is heavy. Many of the homes sit empty now, marked for buyouts or under litigation. The lucky ones managed to sell, though at a loss. The unlucky ones are still bailing out crawl spaces every time it rains. But the best part, the part that will stick with me long after the headlines fade, is this. The next time some overconfident HOA president thinks about messing with something they don't understand, They'll pull up a case study. They'll read the federal report, they'll see the photos, and they'll find my name at the center of it. The man who warned them. The man they ignored. The man they tried to sue into silence. And the man who, brick by brick, law by law, buried their entire empire in the mud they unleashed themselves.